Welcome to Transformed and Transformational, a Teach Beyond podcast. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities.
Today we're talking about goodbyes. I'm curious how you are with goodbyes. I feel like I am not very good at them. I always feel like, well, I'll probably just see that person later. It's not really a big deal. And reality never really strikes me until like a week or a month later that I probably won't ever see them again. Or if I do see them again, most likely,
Yeah.
it probably won't be in the same way.
Mhm.
That situation has already changed dramatically.
Yeah, that's tough. I guess I'm probably on the other end of the spectrum of wanting to go way out of my way to say goodbye as well. And I actually really distinctly remember a summer camp experience. I must have been in middle school, and I've obviously said a lot of goodbyes since then, and more important goodbyes too. But it's just the specific memory comes to mind when my parents came to pick me up. I had been a few states away for 2 weeks of time, and it was a Christian camp, and I had really gotten to know my cabin mates well and felt like I had grown during even just those 2 weeks, and I just cried when they picked me up. I was happy to see them, but I was also sad to leave this, like, fun and just high week. It's just such a memorable experience, and that was just after 2 weeks. So, certainly saying goodbye can be difficult, and things ending can be difficult when it's years of time that goes by, or it's gonna be for, a longer stretch of time that people are apart.
For sure. I can definitely picture that being a very emotional situation,
Mhm.
having to say goodbye to your campmates that you really got to know well. But I don't think I ever had that experience at that level of goodbye. So obviously, we're very different people.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And there are obviously different ways to say goodbye, and different situations call for different types of responses to saying goodbye.
Our guest today is Lindsay Nimmon, who currently serves as Teach Beyond's Third Culture Kid Care Coordinator. Lindsay has a background of almost 20 years of classroom experience, grades K through 12, but her favorite is grade 9 English. She studied English and photography at Covenant College in Georgia and earned her Master's of Curriculum and Instruction through Messiah University in Pennsylvania.
For the past 7 years, Lindsay has been working with third culture kids, or TCKs, in various settings, and she is raising her own high school TCK right now. Lindsay and her family live in Chattanooga, Tennessee now, but she will fill us in on all the places that she has lived over the years. And along those lines, today we're talking with Lindsay about how to be intentional about saying goodbye well.
Let's go over to that conversation with Lindsay to learn more about RAFT and tips for saying goodbyes.
Welcome to the podcast, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me.
Lindsay, we are so excited to talk to you about this topic and about saying goodbyes and saying goodbyes well. And as we get started, could you tell us a little bit about your history? Because I know you've lived many places, which means you've also had to say goodbye to many places. So could you give us a little intro into what those places have looked like?
Definitely. My family and I have lived in Pennsylvania, Ireland, Virginia, Burundi, and Kenya as teachers and missionaries. Since being married about 20 years ago, my husband and I have not lived in any one place for more than 4 years. The place we thought we would live for a lifetime, we ended up only being our home for about 14 months. And the place we thought we would live for 2 years ended up being home for 4 years. So we've had to say goodbye to places, people, dreams, continuity, our reputations, and even safety in some of our contexts.
It is so interesting how, like, a place that can feel like it's going to be short term ends up becoming a longer time. I feel that way too, where I am in Pittsburgh. I moved back here when I lived overseas, and it wasn't intentionally a longer term place, but I've been here almost 9 years now. So it's so interesting how you end up having longer or shorter times in different places.
It really is.
As we talk through how to say goodbye well, can we start with maybe an obvious question? Why is it important to say goodbye well? I mean, I can see the temptation to just disappear into the night, and maybe it feels like it kind of avoids heartbreak and emotional turmoil by just disappearing, but I'm guessing that's not the best way to go.
Yeah, and I love that you said that because it does seem like the easier way to go. And especially when you're living overseas, you're bound to say more goodbyes and experience more grief as a result of those goodbyes than any monocultural or non mobile peer that you might have. People are eternal beings who are not meant for endings. So goodbyes hurt, but we hear God's call to us as Christians to go into all the world and make disciples. And so we trust that he can and does use this grief to shape mobile people into his likeness and give people full lives. Trusting this allows those facing a mobile lifestyle and those who are in relationship with children who live a mobile lifestyle to do exactly what Pollock, the author of Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds, says: look ahead realistically and optimistically. I'd really like to talk about a series of life practices and heart attitudes that the Christian is called to exercise daily, but that help us particularly during goodbyes. The principles are ways of converting mobility's twists and turns into growth opportunities, which should be our goal and is possible, according to Doug Ota in his book, Safe Passage. It is possible to form and help our families form healthy, Christ-centered life patterns surrounding transition, loss, grief, people, the world, and learning through the process of learning to say goodbye well. When we act in intentional ways rather than just disappearing into the night, especially during that process of saying goodbye, we acknowledge the reality and the hope that is part of life. Saying a good goodbye to a place and a community is part of cultivating personal health and recognizing that we are loved by God.
I love the hopeful, kind of positive perspective that you're bringing to this, because so much of goodbyes can feel weighty and difficult. And it is both of those, but recognizing that doing this well can be a good experience, even in the experience of loss. So I really appreciate that hopeful perspective you're bringing. I know as we talk about transition, there's this common acronym of RAFT, in how we say goodbye. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Before we get into what RAFT actually is, can you tell us more about the background of that, where that comes from?
Yes. Lauren Wells says healthy TCKs allow themselves to love people and places enough to feel the pain of each loss and give themselves permission to grieve each time they leave or are left. And I think that's wise advice for adults too. In order to do this, we must have the tools to use when grieving as a result of leaving or being left. Anyone living a mobile lifestyle, whether that means you are constantly on the move or constantly being left behind by the movers, must learn to intentionally deal with grief and say goodbye well, perhaps especially when the grief results from the goodbyes we must say when following God's plan for our lives. The intentionality we use when facing goodbyes is something we can build both in daily life and in the face of transition, which brings us to the concept of raft that you mentioned.
Yeah, perfect. So let's take some time then to walk through what RAF&T stand for and what kind of that looks like to actually use RAFT as our framework for saying goodbye well. So first, R, reconciliation. What is that? You know, we maybe know what reconciliation is in general in life, but how is that actually part of the goodbye process?
Yeah. So the goodbyes that a mobile lifestyle brings into our lives and the lives of the people we're in relationship with simply necessitates that we practice this spiritual discipline with focus and intentionality. In Ruth Ann Batstone's book, Moving On, she says, forgiveness opens the door to a different way of living where we grow to trust God more, to love others in new ways, and to maybe even begin to embrace life with more wide open arms. Without forgiveness, both offered and received, our lives become darker, more isolated, and even further from what we were originally created to be: people who reflect God's beauty, goodness, and holiness, and who live in intimate relationship with Him. If we don't reconcile ourselves to those in our current community before moving to another community, we move forward as people without forgiveness rather than people with forgiveness. All the consequences of harbored bitterness and broken relationships follow us onto the plane, across the ocean, and into our future community, where we will reflect less of God's beauty, goodness, and holiness as a result. If we are the kind of people who allow conflict to go unresolved in one place, we will be willing to do that again in another place. And that ends up leaving a path of fractured relationships rather than a life that reflects the truth of the gospel forgiveness that allows us to live in freedom from having to perform freedom from worry about what others think, freedom to explore the gifts we have been given, and freedom to love others, as Ruth Ann Batstone says. Reconciliation is an opportunity then to accept all over again that our inability to love others well was paid for on the cross. This is both the reality and the optimism we can have as believers during this part of building the raft necessary to face the grief of goodbyes well enough to sail from one community of people we love to another safely.
That's great. This does sound, I can see the work and the benefit of that, but it does just sound very difficult, especially in the midst of all the other things you need to get done on a practical level before leaving. So just as we look at, all the things to do before leaving a country, packing up a house, is it worth it? Is the reconciliation part, the asking for forgiveness, worth it when we're not really going to see these people again? I mean, I think we know that it is worth it, but it's important to think about why.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as somebody who tends to get captivated by the practical, that is definitely a distraction in this part of the process. But as a Christian, I believe that going through this reconciliation process is worth it. Forgiving others is an opportunity to erase a debt, extend a mercy, and sacrifice for someone else. In doing that, we put aside self-protective, judgmental attitudes that cut us off from other people and even from God. It's easy to see why reconciling then, thereby fostering humility, reliance on God, and merciful attitudes, paves the way for a better exit from one community and a more open posture upon entering another community. The act of seeking reconciliation is the chief way of bringing peace between ourselves and others and showing the world that we are at peace with God because of Jesus. Living out this step of RAFT, not only during the goodbye process, but as a matter of course in daily living, is the way of showing practically why the gospel matters. That's a big and hard calling, but it is 100% worth it.
Yeah, I love how you're anchoring all of this in faith and in, how our own perspective on transition, through the lens of a believer is important for even our theology for transition. I hadn't really thought about that before. So thanks for helping us understand that a little bit more. Okay, that brings us to the A, affirmation. And I think I personally love this part because I love encouraging others and being able to pour into people. And yet, kind of along the same lines with the last question, it's almost like, why does this matter if we're not going to be with those people anymore? But yet we know it matters. So, what does this look like? Let's maybe talk about for kids first and then for adults.
Yeah, so if we remember that identity is something that children living in mobile lifestyles can struggle with, it's important to affirm that which is in line with scripture and the story that Jesus is telling through their lives. That's no different for adults, right? We need to hear that too. So if God values something, we ought to recognize it in and affirm it in the lives of those around us as a daily life habit, but most especially as we exit a community or participate in sending a community member off. So, my encouragement is to be a truth teller to the kids in your life, to the adults in your life, and help them to do the same, help kids to do the same as they affirm others. Be specific about what you see God doing in the lives of those around you, and take this moment to encourage their souls. Our encouragements to others should be affirmations of the things God values.
That's so good. And I love that you mentioned those who are sending someone off too, right? Because it's both sides of this as someone is leaving, whether you're
Absolutely.
doing the leaving or sending. Okay, let's talk now about maybe we can also talk about how a teacher or a parent practices this in their classroom, in their home.
Yeah, sure. So I would say there's no one right way to affirm your community, but if you are in a meaningful relationship with a child, I would suggest open when letters. These are an effective way for someone being left behind to affirm a friend who's leaving. Send a packet of letters that have things like open when you miss your friends written on the envelopes, and then write words of affirmation inside the card. This might be something like, you always made me feel at home when you invited me over for parties. I miss you and that feeling, but I'm glad you get to make others feel welcomed too. My second suggestion is actually rooted in something that my daughter experienced in our last place of leaving. Some of my daughter's friends arranged one last sleepover before we moved, and they had picture collages for the girls who were moving. The pictures of the group of girls even included friends who had already moved away. This simply affirmed that there was meaningful relationship between them and a shared history that they all wanted to see continue in spite of whatever distance was about to be created or even had been created between them. My daughter's collages are currently on her bedroom wall. Launching from one place to another in the grip of this kind of affirming affection roots a person's heart, giving them a sense of belonging even as they face the insecurity of a new place. So, my third suggestion also comes from a personal experience. Just before we left one team and school, everyone from the community gathered for a slideshow and blessed us with words of affirmation. It was a lovely combination of memories that bound us together and affirmation of our call, our gifts, and our relationships. Both the kids and adults participated, and then they prayed for us. Again, I still have the envelope with all the speeches, letters, and drawings from the kids that were shared that night. One of the things I want to highlight here is that small physical reminders that can be kept on the field often extend the impact of affirmation. The critical, self-doubting voices in our heads often grow in volume when the loneliness of a new place sets in. There is nothing wrong with social media. In fact, it has been very helpful in maintaining relationships from a distance. But tokens of the affirmation we want to give people during times of transition allow the affirmation to be revisited over and over again and help quiet the negativity that can come when people are feeling isolated.
I love these suggestions. I think the physical elements you can take with you to remind yourself of the affirmation is so important. Definitely the idea of the self-doubting voices is very true. As you're away from friends and the community, you get in your own head too much so often, and you can't hear the affirmation. I also especially love the affirmation of, we've loved having you here. You're our friend, a part of our community, and we're also now affirming that you're moving on to a next step, that we're excited for you, and not trying to, hold on to the person to make them feel guilty about leaving, about how much we love you and we don't want you to leave.
What a gift for that sending community to see that. Obviously, if we're the ones leaving, we can't control or force what the sending community is doing. But certainly, if you're part of a sending community, then being able to acknowledge that, you're right, Kian, that is like so valuable to honor the time that they were there, but also to affirm that for the next community and not, just hold on to past memories, but say, this is something you're taking with you to the next place. That's so good. Let's take a short break for a story from the field.
Hi, my name is Danielle, and our family lived for about 15 years in Russia, serving at the International Academy of St. Petersburg. When we first went, way back in 2007, our oldest daughter was only a year and a half old, and then we had 2 more kids born there, and then we adopted 1 more. So we had really put down some roots there, and it was the place where our kids grew up and the place they knew as home. But in February and March of 2022, the political situation in Russia got a little crazy. We were hearing from different sources that it could get really dangerous for Americans there. And although we didn't want to go at first, with all that we were hearing, we decided that we probably should leave. And after making that decision to leave with a group of school staff that was leaving together, we had about 36 hours to pack up and go. And looking back, I'm not sure how we even did that, because we could only take 1 suitcase and 1 carry-on per person. And here we were preparing to leave our house and our dog and all of our stuff, unsure if we would ever get to come back again. So we did our best to pack what was most important to each of us and to say goodbye to as many friends and neighbors as we could as they stopped by to see us one last time while we were packing. And then we were off, flying to Kyrgyzstan, where we stayed for a few days in a guest house with a group from our school. And those few days in Kyrgyzstan were really valuable, as we at least had a little bit of time to start processing that whirlwind that we had been through with others who were in the same boat. And it was so good to be with others who understood before going back to the US, to people who would be just glad that we were, quote, home, when it felt like we had just left our home. So I'm glad our kids had that time too with their TCK friends from the school. Then we went to Arkansas, where my husband has family, and we were so amazed to see how God provided for our family there with a place to live and all the furnishings, just everything that we needed. It was such a comfort to see how God was caring for us in the midst of a time that was really difficult for our whole family. Later on, one of the things that helped us the most in our healing was that we were able to go back to Russia that following November for about a month. And when we got there, one of the first things that we did was to sit down with our calendar as a family and brainstorm all the places and people that we wanted to try to visit one more time and to say goodbye to. So we filled in that calendar, and praise God, He allowed us to visit all of those places and have proper goodbyes to all the special people there. So that was really good for all of us. From that time on, it's just been an ongoing process for each family member to adjust and transition to life here in the U.S. and to feel like we belong here. Plus, we had another move to Minnesota this past year away from family, so it's been a lot for us to deal with. But we've seen God at work in our lives and in the lives of our kids through it all, and it's been a journey of just trusting Him. And we all have our times of just wishing we could go back, missing the life we had, but we also see how God is taking care of us and has led us to other things that are different but also good.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on Lingo Online, which is an opportunity to teach English online, even for just a few hours a week. To learn more, visit teachbeyond.org/go, or click on the link in the show notes. Yeah, and that brings us to the next part, the F, farewell. Can you walk us through how to do that well? I picture, a big boat like the Titanic leaving the port and the crowds of people waving it off with banners and streamers and ribbons. So what does it look like for the normal person who's not leaving on a big boat?
Yeah, there don't have to be banners and streamers and ribbons. But the farewell principle that is a part of building RAFT that will help us sail the seas of saying goodbye well is about more than just people. It is kind of about that boat as well, right? Or those places. Since our lives are our stories, we need to remember that all good stories have characters who help them move the plot forward and a setting in which those characters' lives are lived. It's also important to remember that although a sense of place can refer to positive bonds of comfort, safety, and well-being, like when you call a place home, a place can also be associated with negative feelings of fear or dysphoria and placelessness. When saying farewell, it could be important to acknowledge both of those feelings if they exist in yourself and in the children under your care. And it's important for children to know when it is time to say goodbye to people and places. Make sure those children know when last visits or last events are happening so that they can say goodbye well. In this way, you will be recognizing for yourself and the children under your care many aspects of life that we will call hidden losses in the next place. It is good and right to say goodbye to the soccer team on which you or your child played. It's also good and right to say goodbye to the banana trees that provided shade during breaks and even to being a first string player on that team, because it's not a foregone conclusion that you will enjoy that same position in your next community. Saying farewell needs to include the recognition that some things will not be regained. While this is fine in the ultimate sense, it doesn't make it less painful in the present. This is one reason why every member of the family should be part of the packing process. It takes longer, but everyone needs an opportunity to decide what stays and what goes, and to say goodbye to the things that will not make it into a suitcase.
Yeah, the goodbyes aren't just to people, they're to places and things and memories and responsibilities and moments, all of that. That's great. So that brings us to the T of RAFT, which is think destination. And this one's an interesting one because it almost seems like we're done with the goodbyes. Now we're moving on. We're, into the next phase. But can you help us understand how that kind of connects in with the process of saying goodbye with RAFT?
Yeah, let me try to do this by talking about a spiritual reality for Christians first. The call to go into all the world is a call to dwell on and share Christ in his life, death, and resurrection. Everything we have, everything we are, everything we look forward to is rooted in him. It's because of this ultimate destination that we can know that everything sad will come untrue, including all the things we lose because of a mobile lifestyle. In Him, all of our darkest fears are defeated and brightest hopes are realized. Because of Him, one of my favorite blogs called A Life Overseas reminds us our forever will be gorgeous. We will know one another in eternal reality. We will become of the sea of face-to-face glory where we lift up the broken beauty of each of our unique yet united stories in worship to the great story of God, Jesus. This destination and purpose of our lives and ministry can guide our temporal, here and now stories if we are in the habit of thinking of our destination as the person of Jesus. And just like we consider that destination, allowing it to mold and shape us in the process of living, we can think about the destination God is calling us to next during the process of saying goodbye, allowing it to soften our hearts to His call. Even as we are in the process of saying goodbye to one people and place, we can begin looking ahead to the people and place we are going. So, what might this look like? Be curious about the new people, place, and culture you are moving toward. Begin forming connections in your heart. When our family was moving to Burundi, we made fried plantains together while still living in Virginia to taste a bit of
Mm,
what we thought was coming. My husband and I read the few available books about the country and people. And even though there weren't any children's books about Burundi specifically, there were books like The Red Bicycle, The Extraordinary Story of One Ordinary Bicycle, that we read with our daughter because it featured a primary mode of transportation in Burundi and connected our world in America to our future life. One family on our future team who had daughters our daughter's age sent letters and drawings of their neighborhood expressing excitement over having her live and play where they were. Again, it's important not to idealize the new place or people during this part of building the raft because it will likely lead to complaining about the new culture and community later. But it is good to begin to let your heart and the hearts of your children float on the raft across the ocean to the destination, trusting that Jesus is leading you there to love a different part of His creation and a different group of people for His namesake.
wow, I love this imagery. I mean, I'm familiar with the acronym RAFT, but then that picture of floating into the new destination is such a positive one. It's such a encouraging thought that as there's intentionality in building that raft, that it will lead to a smoother transition. And we can't control all the choppy waves that come with that, but being able to be as prepared as possible and thoughtful as possible. So I appreciate that, there's an intentionality behind all of this. And it seems hard to fully narrow down the process of saying goodbye to just a few tips. If we say, okay, well, how do we do this well? How do we take these principles of raft and the anticipated goodbyes and just give us a few tips to do it well and to make sure that we're successful. We obviously can't ensure success in this process. That's not really the goal, right? But what tips do you have for us, Lindsay? Maybe let's think of like the top 5 things to keep in mind in the process of saying goodbye in applying raft to our own transitions. Where would you start?
Yeah, and I think to your point, just to emphasize, you
Yeah,
can do all of these things and still have a difficult time saying goodbye or a
yeah,
difficult goodbye or difficulty reconnecting. Um, Doing all the right things doesn't necessarily guarantee the
yeah,
future outcome, but it doesn't mean that we give up either, right? And so
yeah,
that's why the raft is important. It does something to our own hearts, even if it doesn't create the outcome that we were hoping for.
yeah,
So yeah, RAFT encompasses some hard to achieve goals. So whether you're seeking reconciliation, trying to affirm someone, predicting which places and people you need to say farewell to, or thinking about your destination with a healthy focus, yeah, I have a few tips. The first one is pray in advance. None of these things are easy. So whether you are taking that time to reconcile with someone and you need the words to say, you're asking certain things for your heart and theirs, take time to pray in advance. I think that, when we're saying goodbye, it does wreck our normal rhythms most of the time, but choose the most important ones. Like, we try really hard not to give up family devotions during these sort of rocky seasons. And even if we don't do devotions, to at least pray, right? So whether it's like your dinner time pray, turns into this, your family time to pray, because you're finding your evenings are just blown up with packing or whatever. Just make sure that there's something that remains stable that allows this to happen. My second tip is, be honest with anyone you want to meet with about the purpose of your get together. Don't catch people off guard during the process of saying goodbye, especially when you're seeking reconciliation.
Do you have any suggestions for that, about how you prompt people? If you say like, hey, do you want to get one last coffee? Or do you say, hey, I need to ask for forgiveness for something? Kind of how do you actually do that with invitations to go out?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think it's important to make the distinction between, hey, do you want to get one last coffee? And, hey, I'd like to get one last coffee because I've realized there's something I need to ask you to forgive me for. Just being honest with that person is really important if it's going to produce the kind of moment that you want it to produce, or at least give it the opportunity to be the kind of moment you want it to produce. You never want to put somebody on the back foot. So my third tip would be, set aside plenty of time. You cannot reconcile in a rush, without creating more hard feelings. And you usually can't affirm someone in a fleeting moment as you pass them on the sidewalk during the process of goodbye. All of this takes time.
Yeah, and again, it's hard that it takes time because as we mentioned before, there's so much to do logistically, so it can feel hard to set aside the time and space to actually process, to even know what reconciliation you want to be aiming for, and to take the time to prepare for these conversations of affirmation and so on. But so important. So whether that's putting it on the calendar before the actual time that you're going to spend time with that person, or whether it's, putting a journal out on the table. Do you have other thoughts, Lindsay, on how we can practically set ourselves up for setting aside the time to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of it can also be, just don't be afraid to invite people into those practical things. I mean, I've
Mm,
had friends come over and help me pack, in
mhm,
a couple of my different really big moves. And it's okay if you have to say, actually, I don't have time for a last coffee, but I'd really like to say something to you. Could you come over and help me pack this bin while we chat? It's okay to combine those things. It's also okay to just realize that you're a human being. And as much as I have this theology in my heart of saying goodbye, I've never said a perfect goodbye.
mm,
So you may get to the end of all of this and really have to say, hey, I'm really sorry I didn't set enough time aside for that, or whatever. And
mm,
that's okay
mhm.
too.
Yeah. Oh, what good. Like, that's such important permission giving, to acknowledge that these are ideas that are based on ideal situations, and as much as possible to be intentionally aiming for that, but recognizing that we might not have all the time that we feel we need to do this well. What about tip number 4?
All right. So my fourth tip would be okay with walking away satisfied that you created an opportunity for reconciliation, even if you didn't quite achieve it. This can feel like a hard goodbye rather than a good goodbye, but sometimes doing what you know is right is the best we can do. And sometimes we find that we don't even have the best in us. Sometimes we feel mad and we feel upset and we can't kind of get out of that headspace. And that leads me to my fifth tip, which is, don't leave mad, leave sad. Sometimes, in order to avoid the sad things or make our hearts ready to leave, it is easy to forgo all that RAFT teaches us by being angry with everyone and everything. We can fool ourselves into feeling mad so that we don't have to feel the pain without even knowing we're doing it. In reality, this may temporarily push away the realities of saying goodbye, but it won't make us healthy.
These tips have been great, really helpful. And I think even remembering that these tips are good for you And they're also good for your kids if you're living with kids or the community around you, as maybe people are acting angry and mad versus sad. It can help you reflect on yourself and your own emotions, but also understanding others' emotions around you instead of maybe taking them personally or trying to solve them at a surface level, realize there's something deeper going on.
And if you're a stayer and you've seen people leave a lot, you may recognize that this pattern of leaving mad rather than sad exists. And you may have to come alongside a friend and be the one to reconcile and say, hey, I think you're going through something. And I recognize that this is hard. You may not be ready to talk about it yet, but I'm here when you are ready.
That's so helpful, especially right now in our kind of global connected world where when people leave, there's still an opportunity to connect again, to maybe try reconciliation a second time from overseas. And that kind of leads us into what do we do if we're listening to this episode and we've already left? We've already gone somewhere, we ran out of time. We're getting on the plane tomorrow. What suggestions do you have to those for those people?
Yeah, that's great to bring up because good goodbyes exist, but so do bad goodbyes. Goodbyes can feel bad because they were rushed by a necessity like fleeing an unstable country, or because we didn't go through the process well. Anyone who has been through an unhealthy goodbye will tell you that it is hard to go back and make that right, but it isn't impossible. But I will tell you that saying a hurt filled goodbye meant long term, but not irreparable pain in my life. I have gone backwards to work on the RAFT process in the sense that I have had to be reconciled to people after I have said the goodbye. The pain hung over me for years, but reconciliation happened when both I and the other person were ready. So I just want to encourage anyone who has just heard this and thought, I wish I had known this before. You know it now, and that's okay. Go and be reconciled, or at least seek to forgive the person who hurt you. Consider the people you struggle to look back and think well of, and find one thing you enjoyed or can enjoy about them in retrospect. Think about the hidden losses you didn't or couldn't predict, and allow yourself to grieve appropriately for them now.
Such good advice. And I just appreciate overall the thought that all of this can't be done perfectly because we don't have control of every little piece because we are limited in our humanness and the time that we have, and because there just is brokenness in the process, right? And so I appreciate your realistic yet positive perspective today, Lindsay, and for these helpful tips that keep us anchored in what we believe, but also help us to have practical handholds for what transition can look like when done well.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And before we let you go, that we have one final question, which we like to ask all of our guests, and that's what's one thing that's changing your life right now. I'll go first, so you have a little bit of time to think about it. But the thing that's changing my life right now is I just joined a mentoring group at my church. So I've never been a part of a mentoring relationship or anything. There's been different relationships like that, but this is more of a formal mentoring group, and I'm super excited. Part of start joining a new church as a way to get to know people more deeply. I'm excited to have joined it, and we'll see what it looks like in a year from now, how it all went.
That's awesome. Is it a year-long program type of thing, Kian?
Yeah, it's a year-long commitment, and they take the commitment very seriously. You sign like
Yeah.
a contract kind of covenant thing with them, so it's
Cool.
exciting.
It's been neat to walk with you in your what's changing your life periodically being about, okay, we decided to go to this church. Now I'm in a members
Yeah.
class. So that gives some hope on this topic in particular because you're a few years into having done your move to North Carolina, and now there's the feeling more plugged in, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mine's gonna seem very silly on the heels of that comment, but it's been changing my life. I have sort of realized my hair is getting really long right now, and I kind of made it over the hump of the hard part of growing it out because I just was kind of busy at the time that usually I would kind of be done with putting up with it and need to cut it again. So I made it through that, and now it's just long. So who knows what the future holds, but it is changing my life right now. I wasn't kidding when I said I was going lighthearted. What about you, Lindsay? Which way are you going to take us?
Well, now mine's going to seem very serious in comparison.
Okay, well, you never know what you're going to get on this segment of the show.
Yeah, so our family is actually in the midst of transition. We moved back to America 9 months ago. So I'm going to name something that is changing my life that might resonate with other people who are in the midst of transition. Loneliness is changing my life. It reminds me that every transition is a process and that the process is important because God is in the process. And if I try to rush ahead, I won't be walking in sync with Him. I'll miss the good things He has for me in this process and in the midst of the lonesome. So He's teaching me that redemptive beauty will come if I take time to see God's faithfulness along the way rather than trying to fill the voids with on my own in the midst of this transition.
Yeah. That's man, it's hard when there is a difficult season like that and knowing, well, how is this even changing my life right now? Like obviously the loneliness is having an impact, but what a beautiful perspective in the midst of that to acknowledge, okay, this is hard and I want to keep in step with the Spirit and learn whatever He has for me here. I really admire that, Lindsay. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks again for this conversation. We appreciate it.
It's been wonderful.
Every year, so many people in our global community navigate transitions involving saying goodbyes. So if you're in a season of transition, packing, moving, relocating, starting something new, we want you to know that we're praying for you today.
And if you're in the community that is sending, as we talked about today, helping to say goodbye to someone else who is leaving, we are so glad you've also listened to this conversation. And we're also praying for you as you say goodbyes and send well.
Kian, Lindsay, and I all serve with an organization called Teach Beyond. Education plays a big role in missions, and Teach Beyond is a part of that.
As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all He intends.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share this show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.
The mystery word for this week is global.